If you've ever spoken to a friend or family member and told them, I'm a communist or a socialist or a Marxist or something like that, it's likely that the response you received was negative. They'll bring up forced labor camps, repression of free speech, and executions in kangaroo courts. This is the stench Stalinism has left on worldwide attitudes surrounding communism. The very mention of the word communism leaves a bad taste in the mouths of the working class. Contrary to Stalinist belief, you don't need to be inundated with United States pro-capitalist propaganda to come to the simple conclusion that state repression of human rights is universally undesirable. Joseph Stalin's rise to power after the October Revolution in Russia influenced the course of human history for the worse. The rise of fascism in Europe, unfathomable misery in German concentration camps, and the destruction of the international communist movement are just a few of the results of a perverted state capitalist ideology that is Stalinism. As Marxists today, we must correct the global narrative surrounding communism by demonstrating our commitment to democratic principles, internationalism, and socialism from below. We can begin our analysis of Stalinism by discussing its influence on the brand new establishment of dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet Union. Several years after the triumph of the Russian Revolution, as Vladimir Lenin had become unable to participate in politics or public life due to illness, the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union were struggling. The Soviets knew that the young revolution would fail if socialism did not soon spread throughout Europe. With Lenin sidelined, party leadership was left to Stalin and several other Bolsheviks. As Lenin's health failed and the Russian working class struggled, the power of state officials grew, ultimately leading the Bolsheviks to embrace the growing bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, as defined by Hal Draper, is a hierarchy of officials not subject to popular control from below. Now, at the time of Stalin's appointment as general secretary of the Russian Communist Party, the Bolsheviks had been quick to establish sweeping changes to social life. Gay marriage and transgender rights had been enshrined into law, abortion rights were established, divorce was made legal and easily available to either party, and women were embraced into the workforce. And literacy programs were created to ensure that all had the opportunity to live a full life. These laws were breakthroughs for the international working class, establishing an early precedent for the type of radical social change to come from a socialist revolution. Stalin's rise to power quickly halted and reversed these progressive advancements in social policy. The bureaucracy knew that in order to exploit the working class and the peasants in Russian society, oppressive divisions were needed, just as they are under supposed free market capitalism. In another disastrous move for the international socialist movement, Stalin's new regime proclaimed socialism in one country. This ideological change was in contradiction to a Marxist understanding of the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks had been consistent in their belief that the revolution would disintegrate if Marxism was not spread throughout Europe and ultimately across the globe. In a world where capitalism reigned supreme, the Soviet bureaucracy declared that instead of spreading the Marxist revolution internationally, as Lenin and Trotsky believed was necessary, a second path could be forged to defend the revolution by competing with capitalist nations economically and militarily. Competing with capitalist nations meant a need to accumulate capital, quickly industrialize a backwards peasant mass into workers, and most importantly, a need to exploit and oppress the Russian working class and send the surplus value they created to the bureaucracy in control of the state. Stalinism, simply put, cannot be seen as socialist under any definition of the word. The exploitation and oppression of workers is fundamental to Stalinism. Rosa Luxemburg, who once used this quote to describe social democrats, I think it works well to describe Stalinism as well, said, instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for surface modification of the old society. Socialism is defined as a transitory period in between capitalism and communism, in which the working class controls the means of production. With no ruling class to exploit the masses, the state, along with class divisions, gradually wear away into communism. Socialism cannot be achieved by simply swapping out the old bosses for the new. It can only be achieved by a radical change in society, spurred on by democratic revolution from the working class. In 1928, Stalin launched the first five-year plan of forced industrialization and collectivization of agriculture in order to jumpstart the Soviet economy in anticipation of competing with capitalist nations. In succession to the five-year plan, a police state emerged, wherein Stalin began to punish or execute anyone who dared to oppose his or the bureaucracy's authoritarian actions. The persecution included the working class, state officials, and previous Bolshevik revolutionaries, who were soon labeled as fascist agents or tortured into making false confessions. Even the most minor of dissents were not permitted, and criticism of the Communist Party was punishable by deportation, forced labor, and execution. This system of policing, where dissidents are punished and executed, was necessary to maintain a state capitalist system while attempting to create the illusion of socialism. We as Marxists know that the police serve as the violent enforcers of capitalism, whether that capitalism benefits a state bureaucracy or the bourgeoisie. When previous revolutionaries and Bolsheviks spoke out against the bureaucracy and the betrayal of the October Revolution, these so-called counter-revolutionary fascists were done away with in a violent manner in order to maintain the facade. Instead of the working class owning the means of production, Stalin's bureaucracy had created an economic system where the means of production were owned by a dictatorial state, using Marxist terminology and imagery to disguise itself as socialist. Hal Draper explains in his article, The Return of Stalinism, Stalinism represented not a continuation of the Russian Revolution of 1917, but its counter-revolutionary negation. And it was part of the counter-revolutionary wave that swept Europe after the initial post-World War I international revolutionary upsurge. This wave brought Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and Stalin in Russia. However, Stalin did not create the counter-revolution in Russia any more than Lenin created the revolution. Rather, he was its expression, the political leader of the rising bureaucratic class that displaced and replaced the working class at the helm of the Russian state. Internationally, the effect Stalinism had on the communist movement was devastating to any hope of future global revolution. The first Communist International was made up of working class parties in various nations and was formed shortly after the success of the Russian Revolution. Its professed goal was to further the international socialist revolution. As with all things relating to Stalinism, this goal was quickly soured. After Stalin's rise to power, the Soviet bureaucracy took control of the Communist International and set to work sending its members to join and collaborate with reformist and bourgeois parties in order to prevent Western intervention in the USSR. In its most catastrophic failure, the influence of Stalinism on German socialist parties directly assisted in Hitler's rise to power. Most infamously, the Stalinist German Communist Party, also known as the KPD, refused to form a united front with the Social Democrats to oppose the Nazis. Much later, after the end of the Second World War, as a gesture of goodwill to the capitalist allies, Stalin closed the doors on the Communist International. A so-called socialist had defeated the world proletariat's best chance at international revolution and cooperation. International communist parties who looked to the USSR as a blueprint found themselves needing to defend backwards social policies and total control of the economy by party bureaucrats and not the working class. This delusional view of socialism and the attempt to create an illusion of a Marxist society in the Soviet Union created a conundrum where communists around the world found themselves desecrating the idea of socialism itself and changing the worldwide perception of what these words and ideas mean to the working class. International Stalinist parties also followed the bureaucratic model. If workers' democracy were to be allowed in the communist parties, its members may not have ended up following the party line and religiously worshiping authoritarian policy decisions. Relatedly, one of the worst aspects of the Stalinist USSR's influence was the motivation for international communist parties to defend its draconian laws and policies. Left Voice defines campism as aligning with any camp opposed to US hegemony. This component of Stalinism has wreaked havoc on burgeoning communist understanding of imperialism and global conflict. It is tempting for brand new American socialists to associate any country opposing US imperialism with a force for good and righteousness. For example, if the imperialist United States aids Ukraine in their fight against Russia, surely this must mean that Russia is an ally of international socialism and anti-imperialist, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend? Clearly, this is not correct. The trap of campism is that it fundamentally lacks a materialist analysis. If a socialist were to follow this line of thinking today, they would find themselves aligning with state capitalist China, authoritarian North Korea, and the recently ended Assad regime in Syria, simply because these nations oppose the United States. And many so-called socialists do align themselves with these countries. For example, after Stalin's death in 1953, a genuine workers' revolt broke out in Hungary in opposition to the Soviet Union's severe repression of workers' rights. The USSR quickly put the revolt to rest, with 30,000 armed troops and over 1,000 tanks. Tanks were used to put down a genuine people's revolt against the dictatorial measures of the Stalinists. If socialism in the USSR was so glorious, why were workers' revolts happening in places like Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia? These contradictions made it difficult for Stalinists to justify to the working class their position as the supposed leaders of international socialism. Today, when many in the working class think of socialism, what comes to mind is tyranny and misery. This is the poisonous legacy the Soviet Union and other Stalinist states, such as China and Cuba, have left behind for international communism. Several Stalinist states still to this day exploit and oppress the working class in their countries, a key indication that they are not socialist. Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party's rise to power was heavily characterized by bourgeois nationalism and influence from the USSR, not revolutionary working class democracy. When Mao's peasant class won the Chinese Revolution in 1949, urban intellectuals took power of the government, excluding that same peasant class, and with the working class left to the sidelines. Similarly, in Cuba in 1959, workers were not the class in power during the revolution, but an anti-imperialist intellectual class. In the present day, organizations that are sympathetic to Stalin, such as the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, have consistently endorsed the Democratic Party and encouraged their members to vote for them against their own class interests. The idea of taking the time to politically support the ruling class is directly against the idea of organizing your own class and fighting the ruling class. There is no excuse for communist parties to be participating in class collaborationism. This type of counter-revolutionary activity throws revolutionary optimism out the window and leads socialists into the politics of hopelessness and ultimately the Democratic Party. In another example, the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation in the United States, is a thoroughly campist party in their support of Stalinist states, such as China and Cuba, even insisting that China is, quote, building a socialist society. The Stalinists of today have found themselves in a predicament. In order to stay in line with their parties and defend socialism's supposed progress in Stalinist countries, they must defend the authoritarianism and state capitalism that has made socialism as a concept appear unappealing to the working class. Ultimately, praise of authoritarian policy alienates the working class from revolutionary ideas. The average person wants no part in repression of free speech or ethnic cleansing for groups like the Uyghurs. If these are the alternatives Stalinists are presenting to workers instead of capitalism, the working class is unlikely to be persuaded. In conclusion, Stalinism set the international communist movement back an entire generation by misleading millions of revolutionary socialists across the globe towards bureaucracy and authoritarian top-down ideology. Many Stalinists today still insist that authoritarianism is the only road to a socialist society, and that isolated nations can be socialist in a global capitalist system. When we study Marxism, we learn that class struggle under capitalism is inevitable. One of our goals as a Marxist organization is to consistently make arguments against Stalinism, against authoritarianism, and for genuine workers' democracy and international socialism, so that when a political crisis does occur, we are prepared to make these arguments not just against our political rivals, but to the working class at large. Our study and dedication to Marxist and democratic methods will be a determining factor in any future struggle against the ruling class and their oppressors. As Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Let the working class of all countries unite. Thanks.